Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined by Keith Preston and Derrick Jensen to discuss the sort of limitations of technology or technology skepticism. So, if we look at the last century, there's what I might call a broad school of tech skeptics. And we could argue, as far as I can tell, there's essentially four broad categories, some of which make overlapping claims. One is the sort of fear of subversion of democratic principles by a technocratic elite. We see that with Aldous Huxley in Brave New World. We see that with some of the writings of Bertrand Russell on the scientific, for example, the impact of science on society and the scientific outlook. And their main concern is that the process of technique will create this gap between decision making and those who hold the decision makers accountable. The second category we might call broadly the Christian critique is the idea that the true, the beautiful, and the good and morality are subverted and destroyed by technology. We could, for example, see J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Jacques Ellul, and Ivan Illich all sort of fall into that camp. We can look at the third camp of technology left unchecked kind of destroy us. This was common through weapons of mass destruction. This was reached its apogee in the Cold War with mutually assured destruction. The idea that WMDs, whether they be nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, could destroy mankind. In more recent years, we've seen the fear of genetic engineering, which, for example, Michael Crichton, the author of Jurassic Park, argues is just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than atomic weapons. And then fourthly, there's a more radical critique, because the first three are not themselves necessarily opposed in principle to technique as it's been expressed in the 20th century. They're just more concerned about its application. But the fourth, more radical critique of technique is maybe an anti-tech position, which we see with people like the Ted Kaczynski, the Zerzan, and a more radical environmentalist take on the issue. And that's not to say that there aren't overlapping critiques amongst these, which there are, but I think it's important to distinguish where they're coming from and what brings them to this techno-skepticism position. And while each one has a somewhat different description or definition of what a technological society is or what the problem with the technological society is, the definition that I find most useful is that a technological society is a society which rejects formal and final causes in the sense that it says that there are no formal and final causes for things. So, for example, Aristotle would say the final cause of an acorn is to become an oak tree. Now, they don't really get rid of formal and final causes. What they end up doing is the technicians and the planners create kind of surrogate formal and final causes, but they don't really tell you they're doing it. And so it's a way for them to redefine or reframe things as a means to control them. So, for example, the godfather of this modern process, Francis Bacon, in his work on the support of learning, talks about how what Machiavelli did for politics, describing how men really are and how politics really operates, is what the scientist is doing towards nature. We're just describing as it really is. And so we have Bacon self-consciously connecting his work to a sort of Machiavellian mindset. Now, a couple points I want to make about the Christian critique of the technological society. I think Tolkien has a very interesting exchange between Gandalf and Saruman in the Fellowship of the Ring. And this is with regards to Saruman having the coat of many colors, where he broke the white light, as he says, or wrote on the blank white page. Gandalf says, and he that breaks a thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom. And I think that's also a critique that I think you've mentioned before, Derrick, that by breaking things, that's how we come to know what the thing is. C.S. Lewis, in The Abolition of Man, writes, from this point of view, the conquest of nature appears in a new light. We reduce things to mere nature in order that we may conquer them. We are always conquering nature because nature is the name for what we have to some extent conquered. The price of conquest is to treat a thing as mere nature. And so, all right, guys, one of the things that we see here is that the idea is that by conquering a thing or breaking a thing, you've therefore defined what it is. You therefore know what it is. And this is a sort of concept that they're pushing against. And I think one of the most interesting meta-analysis of the evolution of technology and tools comes from Ivan Illich. He basically divides the period of history into three categories of tools. The period of organon, the period of instrumentality, and the period of systems. So for the period of organon, the tool is seen as an extension of the user. So the telos, the purpose of the tool, is defined in relation to the one using it. So it's user-dependent definition. Whereas in the age of instrument, which he says begins in the 12th century, due to certain scholastic thoughts on the matter, we then move to the idea that the tool's use is defined by its design rather than by one who uses it. So a knife is just a thing that cuts, and anybody can use a knife to cut anything. It's not tied to the butcher or to, the soldier or the executioner. It's just a thing that cuts. So now it's a user-independent definition. But there's a distinction between the user and the tool. And then lastly, which he argues sort of coincides with the digital or computer revolution, is this idea of the age of systems, where in many regards what ends up happening is that the tool and the user both become subsystems of a larger system, such that the difference between the two becomes negligible, and they kind of merge into this systems thought or systems analysis where both sort of lose their identity in it. And he argues that what ends up happening then in the age of systems is people just become abstract, disconnected, and we deal with social problems as sort of social problems rather than individual people, right? It's some abstract just talking point rather than individual people that need individual reactions. And so he likes to use the example of the parable of the Good Samaritan, where the Samaritan, having this moral connection with the Jew beaten up on the road, moves his inner spirit to act. So he's not some planner rolling out a program to end poverty, dealing with people as if they're just cogs or numbers in a machine, but he's dealing with a real person hurting on the road. And he says that's lost in the age of systems. And I think now obviously there's some overlap. For example, Aldous Huxley, in his preface to Brave New World, I think it was 1948, makes a similar claim about the man being a servant of the system rather than the system serving the needs of man. So again, it's not to say that other groups haven't made similar insights, but they're all coming at this from their own unique perspective. So Derrick, what are some of your thoughts on this so far?
Well, thank you for all that. And one of the things I enjoy about being on your show is how well read you are, and how that is simply taken for granted that will be part of the conversation, and I think that's great. I have a few responses. One of them is that the thing about Huxley saying in 48 that now the humans are serving the system as opposed to the system serving humans. That was also said by Frederick Winslow Taylor back 50 years earlier, or however many years earlier, but he was saying it as a positive thing. He had this line about, in the past the man was first, in the future the system shall be first. And except again, he was all about Taylorizing, no coincidence that it's based on his word, processes. If he rationalized the processes, for example, of McDonald's or Burger, or what would become the processes at McDonald's or Burger King, where you have the workers do the least amount of steps. It's as efficient as possible. And so that's one thing I wanted to mention. Another thing I'm going to ask you something, and then if you do answer, that's great. And if you don't answer, then I will give my answer. Where does Mumford fit into these categorizations that you're talking about?
I'm sorry to say I don't know who he is.
Oh, we have to talk about Lewis Mumford then. So Lewis Mumford is my favorite philosopher of technology. And his big deal is very interesting because he wrote a bunch of books in the 30s that were very pro-tech. And then World War II convinced him that he'd been completely wrong. And I have tremendous respect for somebody who can publicly take a position, and now they call it flip-flopping, but publicly take a position, and then when new information comes in, as in World War II, you can then go, you know what? I was completely wrong, and now we need to go a different direction. And his big deal is that technologies don't emerge in a vacuum, and they don't lead to a vacuum. So he would talk about something called a technics. And a technics is the interplay between a particular social structure and a particular piece of technology. And in a really good and really short essay called either Authoritarian and Democratic Technics or Democratic and Authoritarian Technics, I never can remember which. It's like 10 pages. Everybody should read it. He talks about how some technics can be inherently democratic and some are inherently authoritarian. And there's 2 points to be made here. One of them is that a way it would be inherently authoritarian would be, well, maybe it's best if I just give some examples. Like mining is an inherently authoritarian technique because you have to, mining is such a terrible way to live that the first mines, so that's one of the first forms of slavery, was forcing people into mines. And nobody does it voluntarily. And if you're going to argue that people do it voluntarily, then I have another response to that later. Anyway, and then also, once you have the mine, you have the mined materials, and then you have to have a military in order to take the land to put in the mine, if it's a big mine, not just like picking stuff up off the ground. And then you also have to have a police force in order to protect the mined materials. And so certain technologies will lend themselves to authoritarian powers, will emerge from and lend themselves to authoritarian power structures, and certain technologies will lend themselves to democratic power structures. An example of a democratic technique might be pottery or weaving, basket weaving especially, because nobody can control your access to reeds. And a bow and arrow would be a democratic technique or a spear would be a democratic technique because anybody can make one. And yes, they can control you at the point of a spear, but anybody can make a spear. You might make it poorly, but you can still make it, as opposed to a gun. A gun is an authoritarian technique, not because it can shoot farther, but because if you have a gun and somebody controls your access to the metal for the bullets and controls your access to the gunpowder, you no longer have a gun. And so whoever controls those, if there are limitable resources that allow for control, then that would be one argument for something being an authoritarian technique. But it's not just that. He also argues, and this is where I think it gets really cool, he also argues that certain technologies would be authoritarian, not merely because they lend themselves to authoritarian techniques, but because they themselves begin to run society, which is exactly the Aldous Huxley and Frederick Winslow Taylor thing, except that Taylor thought it was good. And so an example of that would be automobiles. That Well, first, I want to go back again because I'm not doing a great job of describing this. That a tangible way that an automobile affects how you perceive the world is that if you have a car, you think about the grocery store differently. That the grocery store is about 3 miles away from where I live. And if I didn't have a car, then I would have to walk to the grocery store and I would have to carry things home and I would make sure I wouldn't forget anything. Since it's 3 miles, I don't care. You know, if I forget the toilet paper, I just go back. And anyway, back to the original thing that they become themselves authoritarian such that our cities are not really designed for human beings. They're designed for cars. And the economy is not, you know, when they talk about no blood for oil, they're talking about wars being fought for oil. I mean, the technology is kind of in charge when you're fighting, you know, in World War II. One of the reasons that the Nazis invaded, or the Germans invaded Russia, or the Soviet Union, was A, because the Plosti oil fields in Romania were pretty close to the border, and B, because they really wanted the oil fields in the Caucasus. There's also the land question. But the point is that they actually started a war for this resource, for this, to serve the machines ultimately. So, or we talk about this, you know, that there's great concern about global warming is going to mess up everything, yet they still can't break the addiction to oil. Who's in charge and who's actually in charge? Or another way to look at this is, I used to ask at my talks, I would ask literally over the years, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people, probably ultimately when you put them all together, do you believe that the government takes better care of human beings or corporations? And nobody ever said human beings. Every single person said corporations. Who's in charge? You know, the corporation is a fiction. Oh, that's one last thing I want to say about Mumford, and then I'll shut up, which is he argued, and I don't know if he actually argued this, but I would say this. I think the most important invention of the last 10,000 years is not the lever or the screw or the pump. I think it's what Lewis Mumford called the mega machine. And what he calls the mega machine is a machine composed of human parts that are fundamentally replaceable. It's the army, it's the corporation. The prototypical example that he uses is the basically construction army used to build the pyramids. And this is really extraordinary because I don't know. I mean, I don't think that humans are fundamentally evil or fundamentally violent, but I do think that humans are fundamentally contentious. And anybody who's ever, you know, tried to organize 12 people knows that there's going to be. I mean, we pick at each other, we gossip, and it's an extraordinary accomplishment to get 20,000 or 1 million people working together to accomplish one end. And it doesn't matter whether that end, and this is the point, it doesn't matter whether that end is invading Russia, turning trees into 2x4s, producing Coca-Cola, producing a healthcare system. That's why when countries invade other countries, only if they're really stupid do they destroy the bureaucracies. Because what you want is you want them to just convert over to working for you. And, you know, somebody has to still run the sewage treatment plants, and those rely on these bureaucracies. And so he calls those machines as well. And I really like that. So there's my thumbnail sketch of Lewis Mumford.
All right, Keith Preston.
Yeah, there's a lot I could say to that. On that final point about when countries invade others, they want to keep the bureaucracy intact as an effective means of management. Even the Third Reich did that. When the Third Reich started to invade and occupy Eastern European countries, typically who they would pick out to be their puppet rulers would be people within the existing state or the existing military that they could use as collaborators. They would typically bypass the local fascist party or Nazi party or whoever it would have been that would have shared their ideology in a more explicit way, usually because they viewed these people as unreliable and basket cases, and they were like, well, we want people who can actually run things at least. So even they had that kind of insight. But some of it sounds like in many ways Mumford's critique of technology resembles, I think it resembles Marx on a certain level, and also some traditionalist critics of the Industrial Revolution, because during that time period of industrialization, one of the ideas that Marx had was that, well, industrialization turns humans into a cog in the machine, into this system of industrial production where you're alienated from your labor, whereas a craftsman might actually have the experience of actually making something. A cobbler makes a pair of shoes, or a glass blower makes a vase or something like that. In an industrial system of production, it's like you were saying, this kind of Frederick Winslow Taylor model, where every person contributes as little as possible. And there are people even today that their job is they just stand on an assembly line and plug in a screw when the next unit comes or something like that. That's their entire life. And so you have that, but you also find criticisms of that among a lot of traditionalist critics of capitalism, or critics of technology or industrialization. A good example was some of the distributists like G.K. Chesterton, and some of the Hilaire Belloc, and some of those believed that the impact of industrialization was that human beings were disconnected from what provided them with a sense of rootedness in the past. Because one of the things that industrialization and technological advancement did was it certainly, if nothing else, it uprooted traditional societies where previously a person might have a stronger sense of place or identity or belonging to something. I mean, whatever it was. I mean, whether it was their village or town or clan or tribe or family or religion or something. But you start to see these kinds of distinctions eradicated somewhat during the rise of modernity, and during the same time that scientism and industrialization and capitalism and all these commercial society are starting to develop. And then there's this traditional idea that something somewhere has been lost, and I think that's a major strand, I think, within these critiques of technology that you see coming from some of these camps that Todd is talking about, some of these anti-modernist camps. Of course, Marx's idea was, well, we need to move past the stage of alienation, and then his prediction is that with socialism or communism or whatever, you would, all of that would be reconciled, because you'd have this kind of restored true human nature or whatever. And then you have others that wanted to abolish industrial or technological civilization. But a lot of what Derrick was saying also reminded me of Max Weber's idea of the iron cage. The idea, well, what we've done in these modern societies is we may have cars and things like that, but we've also put ourselves in a cage, in the sense that we're all cogs to these kinds of technological systems, that we can't really function independently of it. I remember probably about 15 to 20 years ago, there was a hurricane in the area that I live in, and my electricity in my building was out for a couple of weeks. And I remember thinking, wow, this really sucks. I mean, like, I'm using kerosene lamps and all these kinds of things. And then I thought, well, this is how people live for most of history. I mean, I'm like in that 99.99% of human history that actually has, electricity as an expected convenience. So, how did people do in the past? And I'm like, well, I guess they did fine, because we're all, the species is still here. But it is interesting how dependent on this we become. Like, one thing I do with students, because all of my students are typically, not all of them, but on average, they're in their late teens, early 20s. So they're all from the generation now that grew up with the internet, with email, with iPhones. They've never known a world without it. I never had any of that stuff until I was in my 30s, but they've never known a world without any of this stuff. And I'll ask them this question: what would you do if every iPhone in the world just evaporated tomorrow? Or what would you do if every laptop or every computer evaporated tomorrow, and that it was just gone? And they were like, well, I don't know. I mean, how could anybody live? We'd all die. It's horrible things would happen. And I'm like, yeah, but what I just described is the world as it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It's the world I grew up in. I didn't have any of that stuff. And so it's almost like technology. I'm not a really strong anti-tech person, actually, but it also seems like technology is almost like a drug in certain ways, because we get so dependent on it to the point that we can't imagine life without it. I was telling someone recently, I was talking about sending text messages. I remember when text messaging first came along, I remember thinking to myself, is that really necessary? I mean, does somebody really have to be so lazy that they can't even make a phone call? They have to send a text message instead, And now I find myself thinking like that. I'm thinking, forget phone calls. I'll just send a text message. Or if somebody says, well, I'll call you at 5 o'clock, whatever, I'll just text you. Don't worry about the phone call. So it does have this kind of innate dependency building dimension to it. And I also think it's really interesting that a lot of these tech moguls, these Bill Gates and Steve Jobs type characters, from what I've read about the biographies of these guys, many of them would not let their own children have access to the technology that they invented. They were like, well, no, you can have that when you get older, but no, you're not going to have a cell phone or a computer or whatever it is, while you're a child. So obviously they know something.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the interesting elements of the critique of the scientific outlook that goes in the first category, the second category of we're going to all destroy ourselves, is something that was stated by the British general from World War I at the end of World War II, J.F.C. Fuller. And what can we call this striving to destroy lead to? To a veritable religion of death in which the scientist becomes the immolating high priest and the humanity the sacrificial victim. And I think that's really interesting, because if you look at also the critique of C.S. Lewis, like saying that hideous strength, there is this sacrificial nature where what we give up to, there's a twofold part, right? We give something up to the technological process, but then also somebody or someone or something has to be sacrificed for it as well. And the fact that we have this, as you mentioned earlier, Keith, almost like an addiction to it, creates this further sacrificial mindset, because something is lost. So, for example, in the First World War, all combatants initially wanted to preserve the sort of civil niceties that had marked earlier conflicts. The idea that we have instances of fighter pilots flying past each other, just waving. They thought it was dishonorable, to shoot somebody in the back, or they're like, oh man, this guy is, a knight of the sky. I don't want to shoot him down. There's a lot of these niceties. There was the Christmas truce in 1914, the Easter truce on the Eastern Front in 1916, and one of the complaints amongst all combatants, we see this also with like C.S. Lewis and his work in The Lord of the Rings, there's a lot of these niceties that sort of humanize the rather inhuman endeavor, war, are completely swept away. Those more human niceties that limited the use of violence and the dehumanization of the combatants and protected civilians was eroded by this process of industrialization, because World War I is often called the first industrial war. And you could argue that was in the realm of war where this mass dehumanization and arguably mass human sacrifice was first really witnessed. And a lot of the techno-utopians of the 20s and 30s, like H.G. Wells, like Bertrand Russell, after World War II were like, yeah, that's not going to happen. We already saw what can happen with concentration camps, slave labor, nuclear bombs, poison gas. They kind of gave up on it. But I think what's really interesting from the Christian critique, which we don't really see in the other three, is, for example, C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man. What is the abolition of man? It's when the sort of technological process of conquering nature, making everything nature by breaking it, by conquering it, they then do it to man himself. And of course, that whole system of decision making would balk or object to any sort of ethical or moral oversight. And so then he says, well, what is governing the decisions of these technicians, these politicians, if it's not appeal to something outside the system? Because there's nothing outside the system. It's their own innate desires, right? is so basically nature has the last laugh, because what's actually in charge of everything is sub-rational motivations. And one of the things that we see with modern corporations is that they, using the Freudian interplay of sex and death, they try to sell goods and services by preying upon these sort of subconscious or, id aspects of humanity. And I think what's interesting is the idea that if you have these desires, this is the more traditional perspective. So Aristotle would say human desires by nature are limitless. So therefore we have to, through education and other means, teach people to limit their desires. But with the technological system, it sort of preys upon our overweening desire for things like security, abundance, things like that. And it's you could argue that if you had people that were educated or conditioned and habituated to checking their desires, it would be very difficult to envision a mass consumer society, because without having these desires that are constantly on tap to be sort of facilitated and stirred up by either the techno profits or the consumer, advertisers, it's difficult to envision how people would go along with this, because they wouldn't need to, right? The sort of sense of inadequacy or danger or security would be met in some other way. And the way that this system sort of grew at the expense of human liberty was, well, we'll make you safer. We'll end want. We'll make abundance. We'll make it more convenient. You don't have to do that yourself. We have machines and experts to do it. But of course, what ends up becoming the problem is that you've given up a lot more than you thought you were. And now it turns out you can't live without the machine, as Ted Kaczynski points out. If you were to unplug from the machine, you'd die. And then you realize it was a trick, but it's too late at that point. And I think that's the key insight that the sort of Christian element of this tech skepticism brings, is the other three don't seem to be as cognizant of the role desire plays in these issues. And if individuals were habituated to limit their desires, to control their desires, then we would have a society, a body of individuals that are less susceptible to the wiles and allures of this system. And it does seem to be interesting that this system, as it was imposed, sought to discredit all these desires. These values are, just subjective values that you have. Right or wrong is just a relative concept. So, your old Christian morality or your old classical morality is thrown out as just some man-made construct, so that they could have free reign to then impose this. And I just read Fuller. He seems to get that. But a lot of other people don't seem to be as cognizant of the importance of let me put it this way. What I notice with a lot of critiques of technology is that they tend to assume certain things along with the technicians. So the idea that man is environmentally conditioned, and that environment, maybe nurture isn't irrelevant. Maybe it has a part to play, but it's got this very minor subsidiary role. And I think that leaving that out of the equation hurts these other three groups. Go ahead, Derrick.
Somebody's at my door. I got to go get it. So keep going.
Yeah. Okay. But so that's one of the things that I would say about this, is that when you sort of have a purely environmental outlook on the problem, it also sort of limits your ability to analyze the problem, because the problem is there's certainly an environmental factor to it, but I think an underlying factor, or maybe more fundamental factor, is individual human appetites. And I think that that's the element that, say, C.S. Lewis or Tolkien or Lowell or Illich would bring to the table that the other groups are not as self-consciously consistent on, or don't even bring up at all. So what are some of your thoughts, Keith?
Well, one thing that I think is interesting about this is you were talking about war, where in modern warfare in the last century and a half, I guess, there's been this move away from the idea of chivalry in warfare, where even warfare has a certain number of a certain set of rules or standards that you don't violate and things like that. it's moved towards this idea of total war. That is, that well, everything is a legitimate target. Civilians are a legitimate target. Incinerating entire cities is legitimate as well. I think it's interesting that that idea emerged right at the same time that mass societies were emerging, and right at the same time that you see technologically driven societies emerging. You see all of these things converging at the same time: total war, mass societies, and technological societies. And I think one of the reasons for that is that one of the impacts of industrialization and the technological revolution was that everything became much more impersonal. Now, this is another criticism that you find in a lot of traditionalist critiques of modernity, and some more leftist or anti-modernist critiques as well. And that is that because people have no sense of rootedness in anything, and because they're just sort of like part of this amorphous mass of people, of consumers, workers, taxpayers, part of this wider institutional machinery, that has this effect of dehumanization, where you're no longer about trying to engage with others in some kind of civil way. Instead, it's all just about destroying competitors because they're impersonal. You certainly see that, like you were talking about the example of in war, even in as late as World War One, fighter pilots would fly past each other and wave and stuff like that. By World War II, that would have been unthinkable. You may have found rare instances of that between individuals, but more and more it just became about totally annihilating the enemy. You had these codes of chivalry that had developed in certain aspects of Western civilization prior to modernity, or modern warfare at least, where there's this idea of you show a certain amount of respect to your enemy, and things like that. It's almost like sports or something like that. There's this idea that there's a bad sportsman. Somebody exhibits bad sportsmanship if they are a sore loser or they cheat at the game or something like that. But increasingly, statecraft, I think, in modernity, in many ways, and that's not to say this wasn't an issue before, but statecraft starts to resemble more like the mafia. It's more like it's more like the idea was just all about getting over on enemies however you can, and it doesn't really matter how you do it. And when you combine that with raw technological power, you've got some real issues. And you see that, during World War II, for example, you see Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You incinerate entire cities, and that's just that's just what we had to do to win. Sorry. It's interesting because when I was growing up, I grew up in a very patriotic, conservative, and very religious environment. And looking back on it, it's amazing to me how many people I grew up around who thought of themselves as good, moral Christian people, who thought the invention of the atomic bomb was the most awesome thing ever. Man, we incinerated in Hiroshima. Wasn't that fantastic? So it's interesting how the psychological effects of these kinds of technological developments have really shaped the wider moral paradigm.
Derrick, what were some of your thoughts on that? All of that.
Well, there's a few things. One of them is you were talking about the how war became even less humane, or how we want to put it. And of course, there were times in the past. Genghis Khan was not particularly nice, or Tamerlane the Great was not particularly nice. But having said that, there was a time when it would become better. And I know more, the war that I've studied the most is the American Civil War. And two things. One is that they invented landmines, but they didn't use them because they thought that would be unfair to kill non-combatants. And it's not okay to kill combatants during not a battle either. That would be just unfair to put one on the road and have somebody blow up. And also, as you probably know, there were more people died of dysentery in the American Civil War than died of bullets. And diarrhea was a huge problem. And there was a courtesy that if somebody is caught short, as it were, in the middle of a battle, it would be extremely bad manners to shoot somebody while they're pooping. So that was just a rule, which I cannot see happening on the Eastern Front in World War II. You know, if you get someone in your sights, one would hope you would shoot them. So that was one thing. The next thing is another thing that Mumford talked about quite a lot was how this, and Erich Fromm talks about this too, about how the end point of all of this technologization is the death of everything. It's a preference for the mechanical over the living, and that that leads. My central thing for everything is the health of the natural world, and yes, I fully recognize about the reduction of freedoms, et cetera, and that's an important part. But my primary deal is always that it's not. There is no free lunch, and what technologies do is they extend your ability to control or destroy at a distance, and there's a great line by Richard Dawkins where he says, this is pretty close to an exact quote: "Science bases its claims to truth on its spectacular ability to predict what will happen and when, and to make matter and energy jump through hoops on command." And there's a sense in which that's true, that, you know, you flip on a light switch and it works. And that's how we know that, you know, what we were taught in our electricity and magnetism courses is true, and what we were taught in our classes on electrical engineering are true. But that's a presumption. That one of the examples I give to counter this is, what if you and I are in the same room and I have a gun and I hold a gun on you and I say, on the count of 3, you're going to jump through a hoop or I'm going to shoot you. And then what do you know? On the count of 3, you jump through the hoop. I'm a genius because I just made matter and energy jump through hoops on command. And also I predicted what would happen and when. But in doing so, I've destroyed all possibility of relationship with you. I've destroyed our friendship. I'm presuming that if I actually put a gun on you and told you to do that, you would not have me on your podcast again. And so something is always lost. And also, you know, I've got a book coming out in a little while about how wind and solar really don't help the planet. And one of the things that we talk about in there is that solar photovoltaics are not the product of the solar photovoltaic tree. You know, they came from somewhere, and that somewhere was where someone else lived, and that somewhere was destroyed through mining those products, or those resources to be made into the products. So I just wanted to mention that too. And then I mentioned the Mumford. Oh, and then a couple more things. There are unintended side effects too. That I lived in Spokane in my 30s, and there was an ice storm that knocked out electricity for about 2 weeks. And I had plenty of wood, so I was nice and warm, but I didn't have heat. So I didn't have light. I had heat, but no light. And I'm going to jump subjects for a second. I had a friend who always thought that the most problematical human invention was the light bulb because it destroyed our sleep. And I have to say, so I was going to bed about 5 o'clock every night, and I would wake up and look at my little battery alarm clock in the middle of the night, and it's like, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and I've already slept for 7 hours, and I got 6 more hours to sleep. And after about 5 days of this, it is the only time in my adult life that I have ever been fully rested. It was so glorious to not be tired all the time. And now you can say, Derrick, that's fine. Just why don't you do that with the electricity still on? Because I'm an addict. Because I'm addicted to having the electric lights at night. Okay, and then one more thing I want to mention is the thing that got interrupted down there, and this is just an interesting story about the interplay between real life and technology. So I ordered a carton of books from my publisher, and they arrived Thursday, but I did not get them. I got the tracking saying they were here, but nothing. I looked Thursday night, I didn't find them. I looked Friday night, I forgot to look up Friday during the day. And then Saturday during the day, I look out and I see a big pile. I see some white in the forest. So I go to investigate, and the white is a whole bunch of ripped apart books. And what had happened is bears had carried the carton of books into the forest and ripped it apart, because that's what they do. And I had already filed a claim with UPS at that point saying that saying that they never arrived because I didn't see them yet. So then I was going to do the right thing, and I called UPS, and I got those. Yes, I'm going to work my jaws now and speak with very tight jaws, because I got those damned automated phone things. And, you have to type in all these things, and you have to say things. And the UPS guy was just here, which we'll get to in a second. But one of the things I was saying to him is, so everything's resolved, but I do want to complain because, and he said, I know what you're going to complain about. You're going to complain about having to call that number. And he said, everybody swears when they call those. They hate them. It's horrible. Okay, so that's fine. I was not able to get through. It was all just crazy. Just give the tracking number, say it again, say it again. And then they finally said, okay, we'll put you through to an agent. And then they made me give the tracking number one more time. And then they said, sorry, we're closed. It's like, this is crazy. This is going to have a little point in a second, which is finally got through to a human the next day. I said, look, bears took it. And you're supposed to say, nice, that's an interesting story. But the guy said, I'll write that down. And at the end of the conversation, he said, okay, in a couple more days, we will have a solution. We will tell you whether we were able to find your lost package. And I said, I just told you it's not lost. It's in the forest. I just told you this. And he said, thank you. I'll write that down. And we'll get back to you with our decision in a couple days. I said, there's no decision. It's not lost. And then right now, the UPS guy shows up to say, hi, I'm investigating your claim on a lost package. And it's just, let's forget the fact that I was talking to somebody for a while. And there's just there is a tremendous frustration with having to deal with some either bureaucracy. It's like, this is a tiny, tiny, tiny low consequence version of Franz Kafka's The Trial. Oh, wait, there's one more thing I want to say, which is we're talking about freedom. And there's a really interesting discussion that happened in the 1830s between a pro-slavery Southern philosopher and an anti-slavery pro-capitalist abolitionist buddy in the North. And it was the pro-slavery philosopher said, look, we would get rid of all of our slaves right away if you could change land ownership conditions. And it's really simple. There are land ownership conditions in which it's in the capitalist's best interest to own slaves and not own slaves. And if there's a lot of people, if there's not many people and a lot of land, that means people have access to land, which means they have access to food, clothing, and shelter, which means they have access to self-sufficiency, which means the only way you can get them to work for you is at the point of a gun. In that case, you have to own them. On the other hand, if you have a lot of people, like in a city, and not much land, but a lot of people, that means they don't have access to land, which means they don't have access to self-sufficiency, which means you don't have to own them. In fact, it's a better economic decision to not own them and just pay them whatever pittance you can. And the reason this has to do with technology is that I had a friend who used to be married to a guy from Bangladesh, about my age, so a little bit younger than I am, they were. So he's 50, and when he was 20, that's 30 years ago, his mother would say to him, go down to the river and catch some fish, and we'll eat them for lunch. And by the time he was 30, so 10 years later, the river was so polluted that there weren't any fish, and the fish they got were from Iceland, sold through a transnational corporation. And so one of my points, and sorry about this taking so long, but one of my points in bringing up this particular part is that as we become increasingly technologized, we are going to be more reliant upon these distant economic entities, especially as they continue to destroy the basis for life and for our ability to physically sustain ourselves through. There's no reason for me to go to the grocery store if there were still salmon in the stream that's 30 yards that way. And that's one of the things that's happened with technology, is that it has increasingly inserted itself in between us and the source of life.
So one thing that I'd like to sort of emphasize briefly again is we look at one of the ways in which this system has grown so rapidly in such a short amount of time is that through political connection, among other things, it's been able to externalize the cost of what it's doing on everyone else. So the technicians themselves don't bear the cost of the decisions they're making. Now, one of the things that I think I would argue is maybe a defect in a lot of analysis is that it's not just the technicians who seek to externalize the cost of their actions via technology. It's the individuals in society giving free rein to their desires. So if we think about this, everybody knows that in a romantic relationship, if a man and a woman come together, conception is a possibility and therefore a child. Now, then the question is, who's going to raise the child? Who's going to feed the child? Or maybe you prevent the child from being conceived in the first place, which is why contraception was invented. But then the question is, that is a manifestation of the same mindset. It's saying that we are going to use technology to remove consequences for actions. And if one creates a sort of pre-technological society or a sub-technological society, it's difficult to envision how a lot of these attitudes and beliefs that we have today in that department would be able to operate, because you couldn't have technology externalize the cost. And what I'm saying is what's driving that is a desire for having essentially consequence-free sex. And if you have that desire, and then having the technocratic society say, hey, look, you got that desire? We'll give you the means to do it. And then so many people just said, yeah, sure, we'll do it. And I don't really see outside, at least, like I said, that narrow Christian critique, the other critics at least being aware of that. Well, that's not the only explanation for all the components here. I think it's an important one that's often overlooked. And oftentimes, if we view the externalizing of responsibility as in some sense a fundamental value of the technicians and the technocratic society, I think a lot of people are themselves guilty of that, even if they're not technicians. They like the modern technological state because it allows them to externalize the costs of their actions, and these are actions which are based in an attempt to escape responsibility. What are some of your thoughts on that, Derrick?
I would generally agree, and I would say part of the problem with the technological worldview or the technological material reality is that there is no waste in nature, because everybody's poop is somebody else's food. And, you poop, and then 5 minutes later, there's slugs there eating it up. And then the slugs poop, and I don't know who eats that, but somebody does. And part of the problem is that when you throw away a computer, nobody eats it. Plastic was specifically made to not decay, which means it was made to not be somebody's food. And so a phrase that somebody gave me 20 years ago that I really like is toxic mimic. And that's where something maintains the form but really perverts the content. And I think that I think you're absolutely right. And I think that a few things, that if you are living people say that Indians, they'll say, Indians affected the land base too. Therefore, and there are people who actually make this argument, because Indians affected their land base, American Indians, therefore it's okay for Boise Cascade to clear cut. And the difference is that you make different land use decisions if you're planning on living in place for 500 years. That would be a check on your ability to externalize costs and to privatize benefits, both of which go together. And I guess I should have started with the thesis statement that, yes, I completely agree that externalizing costs and privatizing benefits is a fundamental problem. And we as a species need to figure out ways to not make that turn where we live into a toxic wasteland. And one way to do it is to live in place for 1,000 years, because then you know what you can do, and also to plan on living in place for another 1,000 years, because again, you're not gonna pollute the rivers if you're planning on living here for another 1,000 years. If you're planning on going to Mars, as Elon Musk wants to do, then you don't really care. And then the other part, like I said, is that when your wastes, it's an entirely different way to live. When your wastes are in fact somebody else's food, then you can certainly externalize. I mean, you don't want to poop in your own home, so you're externalizing that cost. But it's a different thing when what would be a cost to you, pooping in your own home, actually helps somebody else, helps the slugs, helps the soil. And I guess that's it. Just that and part of the problem, I mean, there are ways to have contraception that don't involve ending up with all sorts of steroids in the rivers. There are certain foods people could eat that would make it so they would not conceive. The women would eat so they wouldn't conceive. But even that, there's an interesting example of that. There was a plant in Rome which went extinct 1,800 or 2,000 years ago. Silvium or something like that. Silphium. I don't remember exactly what it was. But the reason it went extinct is because it was a really effective contraceptive. And so they used it lots. And I guess you would eat it, or the woman would eat it. And they did it so much it went extinct. And that's, this is off topic. I'll say this and then shut up. That one of the things that I find really interesting about my own perspective is that even though a lot of people consider me really radical, I really come from my environmental perspective as a profound conservative. By which I mean, I just think it's really stupid to wipe out a plant that people in the future might want to use to not conceive, or to wipe out fish in the river that you or your children may want to eat someday. And it's just, that's off topic, but no, it's not off topic, because if you're really looking that you don't want to destroy the world right now, that's yet another reason, or you don't want to destroy the world for the future, that's yet another reason to attend to simply ask, is it worthwhile to have these things at the cost of everything for future generations? And I don't know where that fits into your particular into your categories of technology skeptics.
Yeah, well, that was an interesting thought, Derrick. Keith Preston, what are some of your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, I totally understand where Derrick is coming from when it comes to UPS. I had this exact same situation recently. I had a shipment of books, my own books, coming from my publisher, and they were sent and they were weeks late. And I thought, well, it's coming from overseas, so maybe that's the delay. And then I found it actually had supposedly arrived 3 weeks earlier, and the UPS was claiming they dropped it off at my residence, and I still don't know what happened to it. I live in the city, so I doubt bears ate them, but so who knows? But I went through the same procedure of calling UPS and getting someone on the line who could care less, and then they have this scripted responses they go through, and and then their basic response is we don't know, and so we're still looking. So yeah, I've been there too. But here's the big question I guess I would have when it comes to criticisms of technology. The standard pushback is, well, look, in the last couple of 100 years, look at what human beings have accomplished. It used to be women routinely died from childbirth. It used to be that infant mortality rate was something like 1 out of every other children in most families. It used to be children regularly died from childhood diseases. Life expectancy was in the 30s or 40s for most people, if not younger, depending on the part of the world. We didn't have surgery, we didn't have antibiotics, we didn't have vaccinations, we didn't have anesthesia. Most people went their whole life and never traveled outside the a 10-mile radius of the village they were born in. And isn't the world better now because we have all these things that enhance, for better or worse, they enhance the quality of our lives? We can get on a plane and fly around the world in 24 hours, or and we have this barrage of information we have access to, and literacy rates are higher than ever. What would be the response to a perspective like that? Because that's the standard pushback to these kinds of discussions.
Well, what I would say, and I'd like to frame this as my final statement so we can move into the final statements, is there was a book later turned into a movie called Took Everlasting, and it was about a group of people in the 19th century that essentially found the fountain of youth and were able to maintain immortality. And the longer they lived, they realized, right, everything was met, right? They weren't going to die, they weren't going to starve, they weren't going to be killed by the elements. It is essentially solved all the problems that technology purports to solve for us. And they were miserable. They said that nothing matters anymore. And so one of the points of the story is there's I think 3 sons, and I think the youngest falls in love with this girl that comes in, and he's like, they have to keep on moving from location to location because if they don't die, people get suspicious. And so they have to come back a century later so that nobody remembers they were there. And they can then pretend to be the son or great grandson of that prior generation. And he says, look, drink from the fountain, and I'll come back to you in 100 years. But one of the subtexts of the whole movie was, what's better, to live long and miserable or to live well, if living well does mean mortality? And at the end of the movie, the girl decides that the guy comes back, and he finds the girl's dead. He finds a tombstone, and I think she left a note or a letter or something saying that I decided to take one of the son's advice on this matter. It's better to live well, even if that ends in mortality, rather than being miserable and pointless, having just this charmed immortal existence. And I think that is probably what I would say, at least from my point of view, because of what's the price? As you said, Derrick, there's always a cost, and I would argue that the cost is the good life. So I guess final statements, Derrick. What would your answer be?
Well, thank you for the question, Keith, and thank you for that answer. And it's I just am finished putting the final touches on an essay here. That the way I end the essay is it was supposed to be about water, and I didn't know what to say. But eventually, what I came to was something I've been thinking about a lot, which is if you went back in time 10,000 years and you said to the people then, you have a time machine, you go back 10,000 years and you say, okay, we're going to accomplish some amazing things in the next 10,000 years. And we're going to play a game where 5 of the things I tell you are lies and 1 of them is true. So humans walk on the moon, they breathe underwater, they fly, they remove diseased organs with no pain, I don't remember what the other one is, And then the sixth one is they basically wipe out life in the oceans. They dewater aquifers. They make it so 25% of the rivers no longer reach the ocean. They, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Which of these do you think is untrue? And the people 10,000 years ago, finally, they say, the thing that's got to be untrue is that you kill the oceans, because that's just not possible. I mean, we can flying or driving underwater, or the other one is you can communicate with people instantly and see their faces from thousands of miles away. He says those are unbelievable, but it's really unbelievable that you can kill the oceans. So then he comes back to the present, and then he goes forward 200 years. And basically the people forward 200 years say to him, convince us not to hate you for what you've done to the world. And he says, they say, we've heard that once this river was so full of fish, it looked like you could walk across on their backs. And he says, they say all sorts of stuff like that. And then you think for a moment, and then you tell them that for a few generations, humans could fly and they could breathe underwater and they could walk on the moon. You tell them about radio and television and the internet. You tell them about computer games and professional sports. You tell them about jumbotrons, astroturf, and retractable stadium roofs. You tell them about golf courses. You tell them about ice hockey in the summer and hot tubs in the winter. You tell them about life-saving surgeries. You tell them about cosmetic surgeries. You tell them about cans of soda and all-you-can-eat buffets. You tell them about the magnificent bribe. That's what Lewis Mumford says. Lewis Mumford says that the reason that we have surrendered to these technologists and to the technologies is what he calls a magnificent bribe, that we are offered all the things that you talked about, Keith, in exchange for everything else. In exchange for, we will only ask the bargain we're being asked to ratify takes the form of a magnificent bribe. Under the democratic, authoritarian social contract, each member of the community, by which he means the global elite, may claim every material advantage, every intellectual and emotional stimulus he may desire, in quantities hardly available hitherto, even for a restricted minority. Food, housing, swift transportation, instantaneous communication, medical care, entertainment, education, but on one condition, that one must not merely ask for nothing that the system does not provide, but likewise agree to take everything offered, duly processed and fabricated, homogenized and equalized, in the precise quantities that the system rather than the person requires. Once one opts for the system, no further choice remains. In a word, if one surrenders one's life at the source, authoritarian technics will give back as much of it as can be mechanically graded, quantitatively multiplied, collectively manipulated, and magnified. So you say to the people 200 years from now, you tell them about the magnificent bribe, and they stare at you. And then you say you tried to live a good life, and you tried to recycle, and you vote, and you bought solar panels and had a wind generator, run your refrigerator, your microwave, and your laptop. And they still say, that's nice that you had that for a few generations, and look at what you've done to our world. So that's one of my responses to it is, I completely understand your response, Todd, that the good life, I love all that. That's so important. And then in addition, it's not merely stealing our lives, but it's stealing our future.
All right, Keith, we'll give you the final word.
Well, one thing that I think is related to this, and I may depart here with kind of an odd comment out, I guess, but there's an interesting essay that was written by Ernst Jünger back in the 1920s called On Danger. And this essay is within the tradition of the sort of anti-modernist, I guess more of a traditionalist, conservative anti-modernism. And within that framework of thinking, part of that was the idea that one problem with the comforts and luxuries of what they considered bourgeois society was that in a society that was dominated by this kind of middle class normative framework, that the element of danger had been removed. The idea was, well, okay, in the 19th century, we saw the rise of industrialization and modernity and the rapid expansion of the middle class and rising up living standards and all that. I mean, not for everyone, obviously, but much more so than what it previously existed. But then all of that collapsed in World War II. Younger's essay was written in just a few years after. I mean, after it collapsed into World War One. This was written a few years after World War One, and the idea was that part of the problem with too much material comfort, which is the product of technology and industrial civilization, is that the element of danger in life is removed. But people intrinsically want that. At least many people intrinsically want that. And I think what's interesting is to see that the relevance of that to stuff we've seen going on in our own society in recent times. It's interesting to see that here in the United States, we have the largest economy in world history, the most technologically advanced society in world history, a society where for generations, the upper middle class, the traditional working class lived more like an upper middle class, in suburbs with, washers and dryers and cars and all that kind of stuff. Now that's declining now. And yet now that that's starting to fade, all of a sudden, we see our society exploding into riots and street fights and, rival gangs shooting at each other. And, and these are people that are coming out of the middle class. These are not people that grew up in the street. And I think that there is this element of humanity that wants that. There's this element of humanity that if things become too comfortable, there's not enough danger. It's sort of like the I guess what Nietzsche called the will to power somehow being suppressed, and then you start yearning to reclaim that.
All right. Thanks again, Derrick. Thanks again, Keith. This is Todd Lewis of the Price of Folly podcast, signing off.